Welcome, everyone. We want to wish you all a very joyous and auspicious Holi for those celebrating or marking this very sacred, very joyous occasion in some way. So from the Hindu Life program to you and your loved ones, we wish you many blessings and much happiness on this day of Holi. Holi, as some of you know, is the festival of colors celebrated by Hindus, by some traditions of Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism as well. So it's something of an occasion that crosses even beyond categories of different religions or faiths. And of course, it is a celebration and a festival that is open to all, that is welcoming of all. So whatever our faith background may be, or for those of us perhaps who don't identify with a particular religious tradition, Holi is also an occasion to welcome in the springtime and to celebrate the emergence or the return of vibrancy, of life, of color, and to share that color with one another. So although we celebrate Holi traditionally by playing with colors, and so some of us may be doing that later today, we also want to honor some of the sacred narratives that are associated with Holi. And so today we're going to delve into one in particular. Some of you may be familiar with this story. This is the story of the child saint Prahlad. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So hopefully everyone can see this, can see my screen okay. If you can see the screen okay, if you can just give me like a quick thumbs up, that would be great. Okay, awesome. So thank you all again so much for joining us. Today, the story that we're going to be looking at is, it's one of the stories associated with Holi, and it's found in a couple of different places. I believe a version of it is found in a text known as the Vishnu Puran, but it's also a story that's very much a part of the oral tradition around Holi and around the personality of Prahlad, who's such a beloved personality and is often looked to as a role model and an exemplar. And so this particular retelling draws very much from the folk tradition around Prahlad. So it may not always line up so much with some of the textual sources, but it is very much a part of the tradition. It's a story that's very close to my heart. And so I hope that it resonates with you as well. I'd like to begin offering a prayer of invocation to my teachers, and an invitation here if you feel inspired to perhaps take a moment to connect with gratitude and appreciation for the teacher or teachers in your life. Om Agyantimirandhasya Gyananjana Shalakaya Chakshurun Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. I was blinded by the darkness of ignorance, but the grace of my teachers has opened my eyes with divine knowledge, which is just like a healing ointment. With gratitude and love, I offer my deepest respects unto these teachers. We all stand on foundations that were built by others. We are the recipient of blessings. We benefit from the hard work and from the selfless service of others. And so with this spirit in mind, especially as we honor someone who has become a great role model and teacher within this tradition, Prahlad, with this in mind and in this spirit, I want to just take a moment to thank my teachers, those souls who have appeared in my life and have so painstakingly helped me to grow spiritually. And I want to offer that anything of value that I may speak today, know it to be coming from these teachers and just a reflection of what these teachers have given me. And anything that I speak that perhaps has some rough edges to it or some shortcomings, know those to be my own. A beautiful prayer or benediction offered by Prahlad in the Bhagavad Purana. Swastyastu vishwasya kala prasidatam dhyayantu bhutani shivam mito dhiya manascha badram bhajatad dhoksaje aveshyatamno matir api haituki. May the entire universe be blessed with peace and hope. May everyone driven by envy and enmity become pacified and reconciled. May all living beings develop abiding concern for the welfare of others. May our own hearts and minds be filled with purity and serenity. May all these blessings flow naturally from this supreme benediction. May our attention, our consciousness, become spontaneously absorbed in the rapture of pure love unto the one transcendent supreme. This is a prayer that is attributed to Prahlad. And just by this prayer, we get an insight into his nature, into his qualities, into what colors Prahlad. So as we'll see, we'll speak a little bit about this deeper significance of colors. And one way of understanding colors is what colors us, what manifests as our quality, as the nature of our hearts and our minds. And this was the nature of Prahlad, always wishing well for others, always wanting to see harmony and unity, to see all beings be pacified, be happy, be safe and healthy. This idea of loving kindness, of friendship towards all beings. This was very much the mood of Prahlad. And so especially on this auspicious occasion of Holi, it's a nice opportunity to reflect on cultivating these qualities within our own hearts. So why stories? There's great power in stories. I've read an exchange between one of the earliest Christian missionaries to India and his brethren and congregants back home in Europe. And it's very interesting because this missionary, he writes that he says, I find the Hindu mind bewildering. He says, I look to try to understand what is their morality, what is their ethics, what is their philosophy and their metaphysics. And at every turn, all I find is stories, one story after another. And sometimes the stories even contradict one another. And sometimes when I ask, what is the story of such and such? They tell me not one, but 2, 3, 5, 10 stories. So I cannot understand this Hindu mind, he says. Of course, with due respect, this gentleman, this missionary, he seems to have missed the point. Because the power of these stories, and intentionally I'm putting it in the plural because there's multiple stories, even for the same event, even for the same holiday, even for the same personality, there's multiple stories, there's a multiplicity of stories. And the point of all of these stories is that if we look hard enough and deep enough, there is great truth within them. There is that morality that he was looking for. There is a very intricate system of ethics. There is the most complex and subtle philosophy and metaphysics and theology. And the brilliance is it's all encased in stories because we are enchanted by stories. Our hearts connect to stories. Abstract philosophy, theology, physics, metaphysics becomes real to us through the power of stories. And so we find the epics like the Mahabharata or the Bhagavad Purana, all the Puranas, the Itihasas, the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, all of them are stories that capture our hearts. And because they capture our hearts, they're able to penetrate into our minds and into our intellects. If they just tried to speak to the mind and intellect, we might be able to hold them for some time, but what is our nature? We forget. In the moment, we resolve to accept some philosophical truth, and with time, we forget it. We loosen our minds and our intellects, loosen their holds, and yet the heart, when those same lessons touch our hearts through stories, we recall them and we're eager to share them with others. And of course, as any educator will tell you, if you want a lesson to really stick, you get the student to be able to recall, to repeat, to reteach it to others. And this is the power of stories. Stories can be replicated and taught, and stories can take on lives of their own. They can morph, they can evolve, they can keep up with the times. So this particular story of Prahlad, some of you may recognize it and it may align with versions that you've heard, and others of you will hear it and think, oh, that's not the way my grandmother told it to me, or that's not what I've read. All the better. Let's have multiple versions of these stories. Let's color our stories with one another's, and let's allow the stories to be living, breathing, dynamic things. So this is Prahlad and the Enchanted Shawl. I tried to give it like a Harry Potter-esque title. So I thought, okay, if Harry Potter, I don't know if Harry Potter's been canceled yet, but let's say Harry Potter hasn't been fully canceled. If we wanted to do a Harry Potter-like treatment, what would we call this story? And I liked Prahlad and the Enchanted Shawl. So Prahlad, the story begins, and we're just going to do a light retelling of the story. So forgive me if this is totally new to you. We'll have to deal with lots of unfamiliar terminology and names. I'll try my best to give you a little background sketch, because Prahlad's story, like so many of our stories, begins before Prahlad was even born. So we all inherit the stories of others. So Prahlad very much inherits the story of Prahlad's father, and Prahlad's father has his own really unique, kind of fascinating story, because Prahlad's father is a great king. He's actually a great demon king. He's an asura, and his name is Hiranyakashipu. Hiranyakashipu is a great, powerful king. And in fact, if you read these descriptions, we don't have time to go into so much detail, but what an amazing, powerful being he was. His strength is described in these extraordinary terms, that he's practically speaking the strongest of the strong. He's brilliant. Has this brilliant strategic mind. He's, through his powerful conquering of all the kingdoms and personalities around him, he becomes incredibly wealthy. He amasses great wealth. He not only is he intelligent and powerful on a material level, but he's even so learned, and he has such mastery over the, you can say, mystic arts, supernatural arts, even spiritual arts. He becomes a master yogi. He becomes a master mystic. He studies deeply of these traditions. And yet, the one quality of Hiranyakashipu that he's most well known for, and that in one sense proves to be his undoing, is his great and feverish ambition. In fact, he's so ambitious that his ambition, it kind of, you can say it grows into a great envy and arrogance. That in his arrogance, he thinks himself the all-powerful. And in his envy, he can't stand the thought of any person, celestial being, God, or even the divine himself being more powerful than Hiranyakashipu. He just can't tolerate that thought. It burns him like a fever. And this is a lesson that we can learn. What is the nature of such unbridled ambition and craving and envy? Is that we will never be happy. I may be financially quite comfortable. And instead of being grateful for that and appreciating my whatever financial stability and wealth I have, if I'm comparing myself to my neighbor who has, 3 cars instead of 2, and one of them is a brand new Tesla, then I can't be happy with what I have. And my neighbor, well, she's comparing herself to a millionaire, and the millionaire is comparing themselves to a billionaire, and so on and so forth, until, right, we're left with a list of the top 5 wealthiest people, but number 4 is comparing themselves to number 3, and number 3 can't sleep at night because all they're thinking about is number 2, and number 2 to number 1, and number 1 is constantly an anxiety because what if they get bumped from that spot, right? So when we're in that mentality, we can never truly be happy. And so it is with Hiranyakashipu. For all of his gifts and power and position, Hiranyakashipu just wants more and more and more. And so he turns to the supernatural. He turns to the mystic. He turns to the subtle arts. And he temporarily leaves his kingdom. He goes deep into the jungles to a place of seclusion, and he practices very severe austerity, this very severe form of yoga, which is a yoga of tapasya, of austerity. He takes an incredibly difficult asana where he's standing in this very painful pose or posture, and he holds it, and he's so still that an anthill grows around him. And the fire ants of the anthill start to devour his body. These insects start to devour his body. In this image, you can see half his body is like his flesh is eaten away. And in the blazing heat of summer, what to speak of the heat of the season, from his own tapasya, the heat that's generated by his body causes like a fire to erupt. And he stands in this incredibly difficult posture for some incredibly long amount of time, and he keeps his entire body still. He fasts completely. He performs this austerity. And as a result of it, the divine being, the celestial creator of this material universe, Brahma, arrives and offers him a boon. Hiranyakashipu asks for immortality. He wants to be immortal and invincible, and he thinks if he can only be immortal, he can defeat Vishnu, he can take the position of Vishnu. Brahma says, I can't do that. I can't grant you immortality. Ask for something else. Hiranyakashipu asks for, and we don't have time to go into the details, but he asks for this very clever boon that, while it doesn't guarantee him immortality, it at least provides him enough loopholes that he thinks himself invincible from any being that he could possibly conceive of. Of course, this is also his undoing, because Vishnu, that's a different story for a different day, but Vishnu takes a form that is so inconceivable that he's able to defeat Hiranyakashipu in the end. But for now, let's say Hiranyakashipu thinks himself invincible and returns to his kingdom. But there's another side of this story. While Hiranyakashipu is undergoing the severe tapasya, his wife Kayadu is pregnant, and she seeks shelter in an ashram. Now, this is not just any ashram. This is the ashram of the great mystic sage Narad Muni. And Kayadu becomes a disciple, a student of Narad. And throughout her pregnancy, she very submissively, very humbly takes this position of a student and learns from Narad Muni. And of course, Narad Muni tells her stories, story after story. and imparts to her heart the lessons of bhakti, of devotion, of gyan, of wisdom, of dharma, of living a righteous life. Narada teaches Kayadu all of this. And now not only does he teach Kayadu, but within the womb, the baby within the womb, the unborn child of Hiranyakashipu and Kayadu hears and is benefited from the subtle energy of Narada's teachings and takes deep within that child's heart, that unborn child takes within its heart the lessons of Narada. In time, Kayadu returns to the palace. Hiranyakashipu returns. They're reunited. And in due course of time, Kayadu gives birth to this child. And it's a very joyous occasion. And the child is named Prahlad. And in fact, Kayadu, she starts to forget some of the lessons that Narad Muni taught by the influence of the association, the Sangha that she's in, and taking on the very worldly attributes of the palace. But the child Prahlad, mystically, practically from his birth, he just reflects all of what he's learned from Narad Muni from even before his birth. Practically from the moment he's born, his qualities start to shine forth. Just like if you tried to hide a light, you tried to cover something like a very powerful lamp or a very great shining jewel. No matter how much you tried to cover it, through some little cracks, some little holes in the covering, that light radiates out and you start to see that very powerful shining light. And so like that, Prahlad's natural qualities, as he grows older, they start to shine forth. And by the time he's a toddler, it's the talk of the palace of the unusual quality, unusually virtuous qualities of this Prahlad. Naturally, without effort, he just exhibits these qualities. In time, Hiranyakashipu sends Prahlad when it's time for him to go to school. So about the age of what we would consider like kindergarten or maybe first grade. Prahlad is sent to school. Now Prahlad is sent to the most exclusive preparatory school you can imagine. If young witches and warlocks are sent to Hogwarts, and if those aspiring for the Ivy League are sent to, whatever these prep schools like Exeter or Lawrenceville or something like this, they don't even compare to this school, because this school was the exclusive school of Hiranyakashipu that was designed for Prahlad practically, and for the children of all of Hiranyakashipu's most powerful ministers and the members of his royal court, so that these children from the youngest age could be educated, to be groomed to become the rulers of the next generation in the kingdom, to carry on the work of Hiranyakashipu. And what is that work? That work is conquering others, exploiting others, right? Ruling in this kind of, Hiranyakashipu was not just a king, but he was practically speaking like a dictator. And he wanted to groom his son just to be like him, right? To be in this dynasty, like we see in certain nations of the world, even today, there are these dynasties of dictatorship. And so Hiranyakashipu was grooming Prahlad in that way. But when Prahlad rather was sent to this school, a remarkable thing happened. The more the teachers, who were these really learned scholars that Hiranyakashipu had employed, the more that they tried to teach Prahlad the ways of Hiranyakashipu, the ways of the demonic kingdom, the ways of conquering others, exploiting others, maximizing profit, and exploiting the natural resources of the world for one's own gain and accumulation of wealth, all of these things, the more they tried to teach Prahlad, the more they tried to teach Prahlad, the more Prahlad simply reflected these virtuous qualities. Now, he was very respectful. he was never disrespectful to the teachers or in any way rude to them. And yet he also very respectfully, but very firmly and confidently countered whatever his teachers taught with the teachings that he had received, these spiritual insights that he had received from Narad Muni, and that were still radiating deep within his heart and the inner core of who he was. When his teachers taught him, Prahlad, you have to learn how to make strategic alliances, make friends in such a way that you have strategic alliances and defeat your enemies. Prahlad would say, who is a friend? Who is an enemy? These are categories that we create through our egos. If someone flatters my ego or seeks to seeks to help me in a way that builds my ego, that person I call a friend. If someone hurts my ego or stands in my way, I call that person an enemy. But all of this is an illusion. All of these are veils of illusions, my great teachers. But I don't recognize these friends and enemies. Everywhere I look, I see the same spark of divinity, the same selfhood, the same Atma within me is within you and within all, whether we call them friends or enemies. So when I look out into the world, my dear teachers, I don't see friends and enemies. I see that same spark of divinity, that same blessed spark of my beloved Lord Vishnu. I see within the hearts of all, within all living beings. And like that, he kept countering all that he had learned from his teachers. His teachers became concerned. They tried to correct him in so many ways. But not only was Prahlad continuing to counter their teachings with this philosophy of ekatva, of seeing divine oneness, of atma gyan, of the knowledge of the self, of bhakti, of the gift of devotion, seeing through the eyes of devotion. Not only was he countering what they were teaching, but through his own character and through the sweetness and the simplicity and purity of what he was speaking, the other students became attracted. And rather than go to the teachers, they began to secretly meet with Prahlad and ask Prahlad to enlighten their hearts and their minds with this teaching. In time, Prahlad was brought before his father, Hiranikashipu. Hiranikashipu sat Prahlad on his lap. He said, my dear son, tell me, you've spent all this time now with these teachers in this school. Surely you must have learned many wonderful things. Tell me, what is the most wonderful thing you've learned? Prahlad, with affection, with respect, with deep humility. He wasn't trying to be, a kind of a nasty, rebellious child. No, he with deep humility and respect and love, genuine love and well-being, desiring the well-being of his father. He said, my dear father, I've learned the most wonderful thing that I've learned from my teacher, meaning his spiritual teacher, his guru, Narad Muni. He says, the most wonderful thing that my teacher has touched my heart with and electrified my heart with is this wisdom that we are all tiny and yet empowered sparks of the same divine source. That what empowers me, what empowers all of my friends, what empowers all of the teachers in the school, what empowers and nourishes all of us. And in fact, Father, what is the source of your power? O most powerful King, my dear Father, is Lord Vishnu, the Supreme, the Divine who has many names and many forms. When Hiranikashipu heard this, he was shocked, he was outraged, he was stunned. He said, my son, who has taught you this? Surely you have heard this only from our enemies. And Prahlad again, he said, Father, what is this illusion of enemy and friend? There is no enemy and friend. Ek, one. There is one. There is one truth. Ekatattva. That one truth, that same one truth flows through me, flows through you, flows through our so-called enemies. My dear Father, one day you and I, we will die. All of us, we're born and will die. But that spark of divinity, that is eternal. That lives on. That lives on beyond these temporary forms and these temporary categories of friend and enemy. My dear Father, let us color our lives and color one another with the qualities of this eternal soul, this eternal spark that is within all of us. And let us forget about these categories of friend and enemy. When Hiranikashipu heard this, he couldn't tolerate it. And he realized he had a very dark thought, a very dark realization. He realized that this son who I thought would be the heir to my throne, who would fulfill all of my desires of carrying my name, my legacy into the future, this son has become a great liability. This son has become my greatest enemy. I must destroy this son. And so Hiranyakashipu, he started on this wicked course, this wicked plan to kill his own son, Prahlad. At first, he was subtle about it. He tried to make it look like an accident. He had the royal cooks and chefs prepare a great meal, a great feast, but he had them secretly poison the feast so that Prahlad would die as a result of this poisoning. But Prahlad, before he ate or drank anything, he remembered the divine and he said a prayer. He said, "Oh Lord, you're nourishing all of us. Before I eat, let me remember you and let me take whatever I eat only as your grace, as your mercy, as your prashad." And when he said that prayer, mystically, that poison transformed itself into the most life-giving, nourishing amrit, nectar, and Prahlad was safe. Hiranyakashipu arranged for Prahlad to be trampled by a wild elephant deep in the jungle so that he could claim that Prahlad was killed in a terrible accident. But Prahlad, whenever he saw any creature, even non-human animals, Prahlad would see that same spark of divinity and dignity within them. And when Prahlad saw the elephant in this way, that mad elephant just, it couldn't hurt Prahlad. In fact, it backed away and bowed down to Prahlad, recognizing this great saintly character. In this way, Hiranyakashipu tried in so many ways to have Prahlad killed. Finally, he just stopped even hiding it. He just out and out tried to kill Prahlad. But Prahlad, somehow or other, could not be defeated. Now, at this point, you may be wondering, we've spoken so much, and yet, what does any of this have to do with Holi? And now is the connection to Holi. Now is where our story becomes the story, or one of the stories underlying the celebration of Holi. Hiranyakashipu had a sister. So this was the Prahlad's paternal aunt. Her name was Holika. And like Hiranyakashipu, Holika also was quite ambitious. And like Hiranyakashipu, Holika had deeply studied and trained in the dark arts of witchcraft. In fact, there's a particular kind of witchcraft that is told about in the ancient Vedic culture, where these women who studied this witchcraft could learn how to protect themselves from all different forces and opponents, and how they could harm others, particularly the vulnerable like children, and yet remain safe and impervious from any danger. Some even believe that Holika in a future birth would take birth and would appear in the stories of Krishna as the great demoness Putana. But that's another story. But in this lifetime, Holika had received many teachings and had many enchanted items that would aid her in her nefarious ways. And one of them was an enchanted shawl. Now, there are different tellings of this, but the one telling is that she had this enchanted shawl that had every color and hue you could imagine. So this multicolored shawl that when she wore it, it made her, it was like a cloak of invincibility. It made her invincible from all external dangers and especially from fire. And so Holika hatched this plot. She had her enchanted shawl and she took the child Prahlad, her very own nephew, and she said, let's go to this place. I want to tell you a story, Prahlad. And she sat Prahlad in her lap. She wrapped herself in this cloak. And unbeknownst to Prahlad, meanwhile, Hiranikashipu's minions created almost like a funeral pyre, a structure around them, and then set it ablaze. Now, the idea was that Holika would be safe from the flames. She would be able to emerge from the fire and Prahlad would perish in the fire. Prahlad said, my dear aunt, what is this? I see these flames all around us. Aren't you scared? And Holika replied, oh, silly boy. Don't you see this beautiful multicolored shawl around me? This is an enchanted shawl that will protect me. But you, my dear boy, have no such shawl. What will you do? Aren't you scared? And Prahlad said, no, auntie, don't you see? I have a shawl also. What is that shawl? The shawl is the names of my divine beloved. These names, these attributes, when I recite these names, I feel a covering, a great mystic shawl over me. I feel that protection, that when I'm chanting these names, nothing can touch me. I know that I will be protected and carried and held by these names. And Prahlad began to chant. He was always chanting within his heart, but he began to audibly chant these names. He began to chant this very sacred, powerful mantra. Om Namo Narayanaya, Om Namo Narayanaya, Om Namo Narayanaya. Holika was completely bewildered by this. Now, at this point, there's different tellings. Some tellings say that a gust of wind came and carried the shawl off of Holika's shoulders. Others say that the shawl, the mystic shawl over Holika actually fell onto Prahlad by a supernatural arrangement and covered Prahlad instead of Holika. Some tellings say that the shawl, Holika's shawl, stayed on her, but became useless to her in comparison to Prahlad's devotion. But whatever telling speaks to your heart, the idea is that Prahlad's prayers protected him, called the divine to protect him, and Prahlad emerged. It's a little bit of a grisly story. Prahlad emerged unscathed from the fire, and Holika was enveloped into the fire and was liberated from her demonic body, and her soul was able to return to its spiritual divine essence. So Holika was defeated. Prahlad emerged, the boy who truly lived despite all of these efforts. And it's a very long story. We'll leave it off here. But later, Hiranikashipu was actually defeated by a very wondrous form of Vishnu known as Narasimha, the divine protector, who defeated Hiranikashipu and to whom Prahlad prayed. When Narasimha offered Prahlad any benediction or boon or blessing that Prahlad wanted, Prahlad simply prayed for the salvation of his father, for his father to be completely forgiven. And Narasimha, the happy ending of the story is Narasimha blessed Prahlad that Hiranyakashipu, now liberated from this mortal form, would achieve the supreme divine liberation of moksha. Now, in our remaining time together, we just have a few minutes, maybe 10 minutes or so. I wanted to reflect on some of the lessons, or one lesson that we could learn from this story, because it's an enchanting story, but it's also a bewildering story. What do we have to do with enchanted shawls and little precocious saintly children and their demonic fathers? And right, it's like, how do we connect to that? One way I want to suggest that we could connect to this story of Prahlad and the Enchanted Shawl is really taught in a beautiful poem, in a beautiful, a story, a musical or poetic story that the poet Saint Kabir Das tells. Kabir Das, I wish we had more time to go into Kabir Das and his life and his qualities, but Kabir Das, what a remarkable figure. He's one of the poet saints, one of my personal spiritual heroes, you can say, who lived in roughly the 15th century, in 15th century India, at a time where there was so much happening culturally and politically, but also spiritually, within the Hindu and Muslim communities. And while there were political tensions at times, there was also a great confluence and spiritual conversation happening, especially among the mystics. And so Kabir is situated between the Hindu mystics, particularly the Bhakti poet saints of the time, other figures like Mira or like Tukkaram, like the Goswamis of Vrindavan, like Chaitanya. So like them, Kabir Das is situated kind of at this confluence of the Bhakti saints of the Hindu tradition and the devotional Sufi saints from the Muslim, the Islamic tradition. And there's this conversation happening and this borrowing and this mixing and blending, just like two colors can come together and create new colors. So the colors of the Bhakti saints of Hinduism and the Sufis of Islam were intermingling and creating new expressions. And Kabir Das is very much one of these expressions, who is considered both a Hindu and a Muslim saint by many. Kabir Das draws on both of these traditions to teach about the essence of spirituality, the essence of life. And so he speaks about this metaphor of the shawl as the shawl of life. So I'd like to share a little bit in our remaining time together, one poem that's considered the poem of the shawl of life. The poem begins with a couplet. Kabira jab hum paida hue, jag hase hum roe, aisi karni kar chalo, hum hase jag roe. Kabir Das says, when we're born, when you and I and all beings are born, especially humans, when we're born, what happens? The baby starts crying. And as soon as the baby starts crying, the sound of the crying baby is a source of great joy for the parents and for the family members and the community. The world rejoices. Everyone begins to celebrate. Kabir Das reflects on this and he says, may we do such deeds, may we live our lives in such a way that when it is time for us to leave, to journey from this world, the world will naturally be laughing, will naturally be crying for us. They'll be sad to see us go. But internally, we will be able to rejoice and celebrate that we have lived our lives in such a way. We have lived lives worth living. We have worn the shawl of life. He sings, this life, I'll just try to give a little bit of a translation. He says, this life this body, but more than just the physical body, this body and this life of embodiment is like a blanket or a shawl, chadariya. What kind of shawl? He says it's an exceedingly thin, fine shawl. Jhinire jhini means the threads are so fine. It's practically like a translucent, very fine shawl. You can't even really see the threads where the stitching is done. So it's so expertly stitched together. By who? By an expert weaver, by the divine weaver, the weaver of all weavers, our divine maker. And that divine weaver, he soaks the soul, that shawl. He imbues that shawl with what? Ram Nam Ras, with the sweet essence of Ram Nam, of the names of the divine. Kabir Das goes on to say, what is the story of this shawl? He says this shawl was made on the spinning wheel of the 8 chakras. The yarn or the thread that's used is the 5 material elements, 5 gross elements. He says the weaver takes 9 or so months. In other words, we're in the womb, we're in our mother's wombs for about 9 months. And in that time, that weaver is working on us, is working on this life that we're going to lead. And yet, despite the fact that so much care and intricate effort has been put in to making of this shawl, what happens? We foolish humans, what do? Muraka meli kini chadariya. We take it for granted, and we take this shawl, and instead of honoring the craftsmanship and honoring its beautiful, delicate quality, we treat it so shabbily. We just get it soiled and stained. Practically speaking, from the moment it's created, we start to destroy it. Kabir Das goes on, he says, talking about himself in the first person now, he says, when this shawl was, when I first brought it home, soon after I took it, it was taken to the Rangarej. The Rangarej means the very expert artisan who dyes cloth. So what is this Rangarej? The commentators explain that Kabir Das here is giving us an idea of the gurus, the teachers, the saintly people who, like the expert artisans, can dye cloth. They can take our lives, our embodied lives, and they can start to color our lives with the wisdom teachings. They can start to color our nature, our hearts, our minds, our thoughts, our actions, everything with the ranga, the color of wisdom, of gentleness, of compassion and kindness, of love, of devotion. In fact, Kabir Das says, "Aisa ranga ranga rangarej ne ke lalo lal kar dini chadariya." That the rangarej, the guru, the teacher, has colored my shawl with such a color that he's made this shawl a brilliant red color, reddish color. Now, in the Sufi tradition, the reddish color has this mystic connection where to say a cloth is red colored is like, kind of like in Hindu and Buddhist traditions, where they talk about the cloth being kind of saffronish, reddish, orange kind of color. It's this color that's associated with self-realization, with connection to the divine. So the artisans, drawing from the Sufis, Kabir Das says, the artisan, the Rangarej, he makes his shawl to be red, this brilliant divine red, lalo lal kardini. Kabir Das goes on to say, teaching us, he says, Chadhar ord shanka mat karyo, ye do din tumko dini chadariya. He says, while you, dear friend, dear brother, sister, while you wrap this shawl around yourself, don't be fooled. Don't be bewildered. Don't forget that this shawl has only been given to you for, he says, do din, for just a very short amount of time, 2 or 3 days, metaphorically speaking. How long is this lifetime? No one knows. At most, what can we say? We'll live 100 years? In the time frame of the universe, in the weaver's eyes, what is that? That's 1 or 2 days. So we have this precious shawl for just a very short period of time. It doesn't actually belong to us. This is the great secret. Ye do din tumko dini chadariya. This shawl has only been given to us for a few days. So let's make the most of it. Let's treat it so nicely. Let's honor it for those 2 or 3 days that we have it within our possession, within our care. But murkh log bhed nahi jane. Foolish people, we forget this. We don't know this. We don't recognize. We don't know the difference between a gift that's been given to us, something that's been loaned to us, that's been entrusted to us. We don't recognize a difference between that and what we just take for granted. And so din din melikini, day by day, with every rising of the sun and setting of the sun, what do? We stain and soil and mistreat that shawl. Now, Kabir Das makes an explicit connection to our Holi story. He says, let us remember the great saintly persons that came before us. And he lists them, some of them. He says, Dhruv, Prahlad, Sudam, Shukadev. Dhruv, Prahlad, Sudam ne Ordhi, Shukadev ne Nirmalakini. Dhruva is also a great child saint who has his own stories. Sudama was a great saintly, very humble-hearted person. Shukadev, the great teacher. All of these personalities, and Prahlad, what do they have in common? They all exemplified wrapping this shawl around themselves, embracing themselves in this shawl in such a way, nirmalakini, they kept the shawl very pure, very clean. In fact, there's 2 ways of understanding this line. Some of these poems have kind of double meanings to them. Nirmalakini can be understood that they kept their own shawls, their own lives, very pure. They led these pure lives that are so inspiring to us. But another way of understanding is that Nirmalakini means they, through the power of how they lived, they purified the lives of others. They inspired and purified and uplifted and served others. So Nirmalakini means they served these shawls and purified these shawls of others. Kabir Das, now in the signature line, he says, Das Kabir ne aisi odi juki tyu dhar dini chadariya. Dhar dini chadariya. He says that this servant, Kabir Das means the servant of Kabira. Kabira is a name for the divine found in the Muslim tradition, one of the 99 primary attributes of Allah. That means the Great One. Kabir Das, the servant of the Great One. He says, this lowly Kabir Das, this simple, insignificant servant, Kabir Das, I have tried to live my life in such a way that I'm returning, at the end of my life now, I'm returning this shawl to its rightful owner, to its rightful maker, trying my best to return it to you with the simplicity and purity and innocence with which you gave it to me, or the state in which you gave it to me, my dear Lord. So this is Kabir Das's humility and simplicity, and the example that he's giving to us. I wanted to share this poem of the shawl so that we could also, especially on this day of Holi, so that while we play colors, remembering perhaps the playing of colors of the residents of Braj, of Vrindavan, Radha, Krishna, and the gopis and gopas playing so lovingly, throwing these colors joyously at one another. While we also engage in that aspect of Holi, let us also take the time to remember that this is an opportunity, that we can color our lives, we can color these shawls of our lives with the divine attributes of Prahlad, of Kabir Das, where we can, with intention, we can decide, what do we want to color our lives? What do we want to show up when we go out into the world and manifest our words, our actions, even our thoughts, the way we carry ourselves, the way we live our lives? What colors do we want to share with others? How do we want to inspire others? What do we want to be covered in, and what do we want to cover others in as we wear these shawls, as we wrap ourselves in these qualities and in the names of the divine? So with that, I'll stop there. And I just want to again wish everyone a very, very happy Holi. We're just about at 1 o'clock. So we understand if folks need to leave. If anyone would like to stay, and if anyone has any questions or would like to share reflections or aspects of this story that perhaps sparked something for you, or other versions that you've heard, you can feel free to do that. Please go ahead and unmute yourself, and you can share a reflection or a question as you'd like. And of course, I see we have some messages in the chat on Zoom. So a lot of Holi greetings and some words of appreciation. So thankful for those. So yes, thank you. It's such a blessing to spend this time with you. Thank you all for joining us, whether you are part of the Princeton University community or you're joining us from elsewhere, or you're watching along on the stream or the recording on YouTube. We're just so happy to have these opportunities to reflect together, to share together, and to tell and share stories with one another. So thank you all so much. Wishing you a very happy and auspicious Holi.